Her fiancé didn't want her to meet his family. She got suspicious, so she secretly went to see them and was horrified by what she found. Give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel to help us out. Sophia Reynolds belonged to that category of women who, out of pragmatism or perhaps a veiled self-protection, had decided that the concept of soulmate was a poetic invention, a literary license to sell books and movie tickets. At 28, with a rising career in marketing at a major construction firm in Denver, she believed in goals, action plans, and relationships built on the solid foundation of compatibility and mutual respect, not in predestined encounters under shooting stars. Love for her was a strategic partnership, not a whirlwind of the senses. But her entire life philosophy, carefully built like one of the skyscrapers her company designed, began to show cracks the day her eyes met those of Alexander Hayes. He wasn't the type to draw immediate attention. On the contrary, his presence was almost a whisper in the noisy and competitive office environment. A civil engineer, Alexander was the embodiment of serenity. While others gestured wildly in heated meetings, he listened, absorbed, and when he finally spoke, his low, firm voice brought a clarity that disarmed any argument. He was the safe harbor amid the corporate storm, the man interns turned to when Excel crashed and managers sought a second opinion when a project seemed impossible. The closeness between Sophia and Alexander wasn't an event, but a process, slow and organic, like the growth of a tree. It started with a mundane gesture. Her pen fell under the conference table, and he, with surprising agility for his build, picked it up before she could even bend down. The smile he gave her as he handed it back was shy, almost an apology for existing, but his eyes, a deep brown like the earth after a Colorado rain, held a kindness that unsettled her. From then on, their encounters became more frequent. A coffee in the break room, where he patiently explained the difference between a load-bearing beam and a structural wall. A ride home on a stormy day, with the soft sound of Johnny Cash on the radio filling the comfortable silence between them. A lunch that stretched into 2 hours, where they discovered a shared love for hot apple pie and aimless walks through Lodo. Alexander was the antithesis of what Sophia expected in a partner. He wasn't outgoing, didn't tell loud jokes or seek the spotlight. His charm lay in his constancy, in his ability to truly listen, to remember she preferred her coffee black, and that she got anxious before big presentations. He was, in a word, a balm. However, even in the early stages of that love that caught her by surprise, a small dissonance scratched at the perfect melody. A note out of tune that Sophia's intuition, sharpened by years of market analysis and consumer behavior, couldn't ignore. Alexander had an almost pathological aversion to alcohol. At company happy hours, while everyone celebrated with cold beers or glasses of wine, he stuck faithfully to his orange juice or sparkling water, always with a polite smile and a ready excuse. "Doesn't agree with me, upsets my stomach," he'd say, or "gotta keep my head clear for tomorrow's cost spreadsheet." The excuses were plausible, but the rigidity with which he applied them was peculiar. At a dinner to celebrate her birthday, when the waiter offered a complimentary champagne, Alexander's refusal was so immediate and tense that the festive mood broke for a moment. He didn't just refuse, his whole body seemed to stiffen, as if the mere presence of the bottle was an offense, a threat. And there was the other mystery, even denser: the family. In a state like Colorado, where family ties are the glue of society, where everyone is related to someone and Sundays are sacred for backyard barbecues, Alexander's silence about his origins was a black hole. He'd mentioned, just once, that he was from a little town called Pine Ridge, a name that sounded more like a fictional place than a spot on the map. When Sophia, curious, tried to pull the thread, he shut down. "What's your mom like?" she asked once as they strolled hand in hand through Washington Park. He took a while to respond, his gaze lost in the trees. "She's a strong woman, simple," he said, and the sentence died there, without a last name, without a detail, without a story. "And your dad? Do you have siblings?" The question made his hand, which held hers with such warmth, suddenly go cold. "My dad. We don't talk, and I have a younger brother." "We don't speak much," he replied, his voice taking on a monotone, almost mechanical tone, It was a steel door slamming in her face. With time, Sophia learned not to push. She loved the man who was with her, the Alexander of Denver, the gentle engineer who brought her flowers for no reason and calmed her during anxiety attacks with a simple hug. She convinced herself that his past was just that, the past. Maybe the family was complicated. Maybe there were financial disputes, old resentments not worth digging up. She chose to believe the version he presented because the alternative was scary. The alternative was admitting that the man she planned to build a future with had an entire room of his life locked away, and she had no idea what was inside. Doubt, however, is like a leak. It starts as a small damp stain in the corner of the wall, easy to ignore. But if not addressed, it spreads, weakens the structure, and eventually brings everything down. And Sophia's doubt began to manifest in subtle ways. She caught herself watching him when he thought he was alone, trying to decipher the melancholy that sometimes clouded his serene gaze. She analyzed his words, searching for hidden meanings in his evasive responses. The question that haunted her most was the most cliché and therefore the most terrifying. What if his secret wasn't a family tragedy, but a betrayal? What if in Pine Ridge there wasn't just a simple mother and a distant brother, but also a wife and children? The idea was absurd, clashing with everything she knew about Alexander's character. But the absence of information is fertile ground for the worst scenarios. The perfect man, the dream fiancé, might just be a very well-constructed facade, and Sophia, the woman who didn't believe in fairy tales, found herself living in one without knowing if the prince was real or just a very convincing imposter. The love she felt for him was immense, but the fear of what hid behind that restrained smile began to grow, threatening to swallow everything they had built together. The marriage proposal happened on a clear night, one of those that only a Colorado winter can paint. Alexander took her to the Lookout Mountain overlook, under the pretext of wanting to breathe some fresh air after an exhausting week at work. From up there, Denver stretched out at their feet like a carpet of twinkling lights, a private universe pulsing under the dark velvet of the night. The air was cold, but Sophia felt warm, nestled in his embrace, her chin resting on his chest as they gazed at the vastness. That's when he stepped back a little, held her hands, and began to speak. His voice, normally so calm, was laden with an emotion that made her hold her breath. He talked about how she had turned his grey days into something colourful, about how her laughter was the best melody he'd ever heard, and about how, for the first time in a long time, he could envision a future that wasn't just a succession of days, but a journey worth living. And then, to Sophia's complete astonishment, he knelt down. The gesture, so classic and yet so powerful, made her heart race. From the small velvet box he opened, a delicate ring gleamed under the diffuse light of the overlook, the solitary stone capturing all the city's lights. "Sophia Reynolds," he said, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips. "Will you build this journey with me? Will you marry me?" The tears that streamed down Sophia's face weren't from doubt, but from an overwhelming and pure happiness. The yes came out choked, a breath of certainty amid the emotion. In that moment, on top of their world, all her worries seemed small, insignificant, mere shadows dissipated by the blinding light of that love. The days that followed were pure euphoria. Sophia floated through the office, the ring on her finger a constant reminder of the promise of happiness. She called her parents in rural Illinois, who celebrated the news with noisy joy. Her mum was already planning dresses and guest lists, while her dad, more reserved, joked about finally having someone to split the barbecue bills on Sundays. Sophia and her friends created a WhatsApp group called Maid of Honor Mission, which buzzed non-stop with suggestions for decorations, caterers, and honeymoon destinations. She was immersed in the delicious whirlwind that precedes a wedding, dreaming of a ceremony that reflected their story, something elegant but without ostentation, maybe at a charming ranch outside Denver, with live music playing classic rock and the scent of pine in the air. She imagined her parents emotional, friends celebrating, and finally meeting Alexander's mysterious family, the strong mother, the distant brother. The wedding would be the event that finally tore down all the walls, uniting their two worlds into one. It was on a Tuesday night that the enchantment began to crumble. They were in the kitchen of her apartment, sharing a pizza while planning the weekend. Sophia, excited, opened her laptop to a page of a famous wedding planner. "Look at this, Alexander. They have these rustic chic decorations that are totally us. I thought we could schedule a visit on Saturday. What do you think?" Alexander didn't look at the screen. He set his slice of pizza back in the box, wiped his hands on the napkin, and his face took on a serious, almost somber expression that Sophia knew well. It was the same one he used to dodge questions about his family. "Soph," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "we need to talk about this. About the wedding." She closed the laptop, her enthusiasm wilting instantly. "What's wrong? You don't like the ranch idea?" He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the table. "It's not that. It's just, I was thinking of something different, something more us." The word us intrigued her. "How so? More us than the two of us choosing together?" He finally looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes made her recoil a bit. "I want something simple, Soph. For real. Just us. A courthouse wedding on a Friday morning. We sign the papers, and then we can lunch at our favorite diner. No party, no guests, no family." The last two words hung in the air, heavy and cold. Sophia let out a short, nervous laugh, hoping it was a bad joke. "No family? You're kidding, right, Alexander? My parents would kill me, and your mom, you don't want her to see her son get married." His reaction was what terrified her. There was no hesitation, no moment of consideration. The response came ready, rehearsed, as if he'd had that conversation in his head hundreds of times. "Better not. She wouldn't feel good on a long trip, and my brother either. It's complicated. It'd be better for everyone if it was just us two." The coldness of that statement was like a punch to Sophia's stomach. It wasn't a request, it was a condition. This man, who in every other aspect of their lives was the epitome of consideration and affection, was essentially demanding that she give up one of the most important moments of her life, exclude the people she loved most, in the name of a complication he refused to explain. The image of the dream wedding dissolved into smoke, replaced by the cold, impersonal vision of a courthouse, a signature in a book, a love celebrated in hiding. That conversation was the spark. The small leak of doubt that stained the wall of their relationship turned into an exposed, ugly, deep crack. All the questions she'd suppressed came back with full force, screaming in her mind. What kind of man, such a good and kind man, would hide his own mother and brother from his wedding? What complication was so serious that it prevented them from sharing a moment of happiness? The theory of a problematic family, which had once seemed a reasonable explanation, now sounded naive. The darkest suspicion, the one she kept locked in the basement of her mind, burst through the door and rushed up the stairs. Could he already be married in Pine Ridge? Would the courthouse wedding in Denver be a farce, an act of bigamy? Could the official wife and children be the reason the family couldn't show up? Sophia's mind, trained to create scenarios and predict outcomes, began working feverishly, connecting the dots. The aversion to alcohol, the silence about the past, the refusal to introduce the family, and now the demand for a secret wedding. It all fit into a terrible narrative, that of a man leading a double life. The love she felt for him didn't disappear, but now it was irreparably contaminated by distrust. Every gesture of affection from him seemed calculated. Every "I love you" sounded like a possible lie. She felt like a fool, an intelligent woman who had fallen for the oldest scam in the world, seduced by a handsome face and sweet words. She couldn't look at him anymore without wondering who he really was when he wasn't with her. The image of the serene engineer was replaced by that of a talented actor, playing the role of the perfect fiancé. Sophia knew she couldn't go on like this. She couldn't say yes in a courthouse, signing her future away to a man who was in large part a stranger. Love required truth, and she was living a lie. The decision formed in her mind, solid and unshakable. She needed to know. She needed to go to the source of all the secrets, to the fictional town of Pine Ridge. She needed to look into the eyes of that strong mother and that distant brother and discover, once and for all, what past Alexander Hayes was trying so hard to keep buried. The trip was no longer a matter of curiosity. It was a matter of emotional survival. Before handing over her heart completely, She needed to be sure she wasn't giving it to a ghost. The opportunity arose the following Friday, wrapped in a normality that made her feel like a traitor. Alexander arrived home with a small travel bag, his face tired but with his usual gentle smile. "Soph, something came up. The project in Grand Junction has an issue with the foundation. I need to go check it out in person. Should be back Sunday night." He kissed her forehead, a gesture of affection that, for the first time, felt like a cold knife on her skin. She forced a smile, wished him a safe trip, and watched him leave, the sound of his car fading down the street like the trigger for her own mission. The plan, which had been a nebulous and desperate idea, now became concrete. She spent the night awake, her heart pounding against her ribs, a mix of fear, guilt, and a somber determination. Before dawn, with Denver's sky still tinged a grayish purple, Sophia was already on the road. The GPS on her phone, fed with the name Pine Ridge CO, mapped a route of nearly 4 hours into the heart of Colorado, a path that would take her far from her organized life and into the enigma that was Alexander. The landscape transition was a reflection of her own inner journey. Denver's urban bustle, with its towering buildings and heavy traffic, gradually gave way to the winding curves of I-70, flanked by majestic mountains and valleys covered in persistent mist. The further she got from the capital, the more time seemed to slow down. Billboards were replaced by signs for waterfalls and historic mining towns. Modern gas stations gave way to old roadside diners with wooden porches. Sophia drove in near absolute silence, her mind a whirlwind. Every mile conquered was a step with no return. What if she got there and discovered the worst? A wife waiting, kids playing in the yard. The image terrified her, but the uncertainty was even more torturous. She needed the truth, no matter how devastating. It was like ripping off a Band-Aid. The sharp pain of the moment was preferable to the slow, agonizing infection of doubt. After exiting the main highway and following a poorly maintained state road, the GPS guided her onto a dirt track. The car, an urban sedan, protested against the potholes and loose rocks. Red dust rose in clouds, sticking to the windshield. The scenery was one of melancholic and forgotten beauty. Simple houses with gardens in the yards and smoke rising from chimneys dotted the landscape. The ridges, which gave the place its name, seemed like green, silent walls, guardians of ancient secrets. Finally, a wooden sign, worn by time and rain, announced, "Welcome to Pine Ridge." The village was even smaller than she'd imagined. A main street, paved with uneven cobblestones, was lined by a church with a single tower, a pharmacy, a bakery, and a grocery store, with a faded facade from the sun. Life seemed to pulse at a different rhythm there, slow, almost lazy. Women swept the sidewalks, men chatted seated on park benches, and kids ran barefoot, oblivious to the outside world. Sophia felt like an intruder, a misplaced piece in that puzzle of apparent tranquility. She parked the car in front of the grocery store, the only place that seemed to have any movement. She took a deep breath, the engagement ring weighing on her finger like an accusation. Upon entering, the smell of cornmeal, coffee, and bar soap transported her to another time. Behind the dark wooden counter, an elderly man with white hair and sun-wrinkled skin observed her with curiosity, but without hostility. His eyes, though tired, were kind. Sophia approached, her heart beating out of sync. "Good morning. Excuse the bother, but I'm looking for a family. The Hayes family. Do you know them?" The name seemed to echo in the silence of the store. The man adjusted his glasses on the tip of his nose, studying her for a moment. In a small town, a new face was an event, and a question like that was the prelude to a story. "Hayes," he repeated, scratching his chin. "Yeah, I know 'em, miss. Good folks, hard-working, but folks marked by tragedy." The word tragedy dropped like a stone in Sophia's stomach. It wasn't the word she expected. She expected troublemakers, problematic, or even an awkward silence, but not tragedy. The man continued, his voice low as if telling a public secret. Alexander, the older son, was a good kid, studious, left for the city to become an engineer. But he vanished from here a few years back, after his younger brother Dylan got crippled. The mom, poor Evelyn, still lives up on the corner in the little brick house. Lives to take care of the boy. The information hit her in waves. Crippled brother. Tragedy. Alexander vanished. None of it fit the double life theory. The image of the unfaithful husband began to dissipate, giving way to something much more complex and painful. Sophia thanked the man, her voice a thread, and left the store feeling the air escape her. Her heart, which had raced from fear of betrayal, now beat fast from a different kind of dread. She followed the directions, climbing the steep cobblestone street, and then she saw it. A simple house with exposed bricks, no stucco but with a small garden of colorful flowers in front, a sign of care amid the simplicity. The house was clean, honest. On the porch, a figure that made Sophia's world stop. A boy, maybe around 15, thin, with brown hair and features that vaguely resembled Alexander's, was seated in a wheelchair. He had a phone propped on his lap and was typing with absorbed concentration, headphones isolating him from the world. Sophia stopped at a safe distance, her body paralyzed. That was the brother, the distant brother who wouldn't feel good at the wedding. The reality was much crueler than Alexander's flimsy excuse. She walked slowly to the porch entrance, the sound of her steps making the boy look up. He removed his headphones, his eyes surprised and curious. "Hi," she said, her voice almost inaudible. "Are you Dylan?" He sized her up from head to toe, noting her clothes, her car parked further down the street, her big city aura. A spark of recognition, or perhaps deduction, passed through his eyes. "Yeah. And you must be Sophia, right? Alexander's fiancé?" The question hit her like lightning. She froze, her mouth dry. How did he know? How did he know her name? "I am." "How do you know?" she managed to ask, astonishment overpowering any other emotion. Dylan gave a half smile, a sad smile that seemed too old for his young face. He pointed to the phone on his lap. "He showed me your picture, said he was getting married." Then he lowered his gaze, and the next sentence was the one that finally demolished all of Sophia's theories, replacing distrust with a deep and confusing pain. "He sends me money every month, but he hasn't come back here since." The phrase from Dylan, "He sends me money every month, but he hasn't come back here," hung in the cold mountain air, laden with the weight of years of absence and a paradoxical loyalty. The Alexander who sent money was the responsible and caring man Sophia knew. The Alexander who never returned was the stranger she'd come to unravel. The two halves of the same man collided in her mind, and the image of the traitor shattered completely, giving way to a mosaic of pain whose pieces she was just beginning to comprehend. The wind coming down from the mountains whistled low, bringing with it the smell of damp earth and dry leaves. Sophia felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked at Dylan's young face, at the forced maturity in his eyes, and felt a wave of compassion so intense it nearly suffocated her. There was a simple wooden bench on the porch, next to the wheelchair. Without asking permission, she sat down, her body suddenly heavy, as if the gravity of that place was pulling her down. She was no longer a detective in search of a lie. She was a spectator before a real and painful drama. "Can you tell me what happened?" she asked, her voice soft, almost a whisper, fearing a louder tone might break the fragile trust forming between them. Dylan didn't respond right away. He averted his gaze from hers and fixed it on a distant point, on the outline of the ridges that embraced the village. His fingers drummed nervously on the wheel of the chair, a tick that revealed the storm of memories her question had conjured. Sophia waited, giving him the time and space he needed. She understood instinctively that the story she was about to hear wasn't small-town gossip, but a testimony, a burden that boy carried every day. Finally, he took a deep breath, a sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, and began to speak. His voice was low, almost monotonous, like someone who'd repeated the same narrative to himself so many times that the words had lost their color, leaving only the gray outline of the facts. "My dad, he wasn't a bad man all the time," Dylan began, surprising Sophia. "When he was sober, he was funny, liked to fish, taught me how to fly a kite. But the booze, the whiskey turned him into someone else, a monster." The word monster was said without emphasis, with a resigned acceptance that was more desolate than any cry of anger. Every day was the same. He'd come home from work, head straight to the bar on the corner, and only come back at night, stumbling over things, yelling at my mom for any reason. The food was cold, the house was noisy, the money was short. Everything was a reason to fight. We learned to live walking on eggshells, waiting for the explosion. Sophia listened in silence, her chest tight. She tried to imagine Alexander, the man of peace and serenity, growing up in that environment of constant tension, and his aversion to alcohol suddenly gained brutal clarity. It wasn't a preference or a health issue, it was a visceral reaction, a rejection of a poison he'd known since childhood. Dylan continued, his eyes still lost in the landscape. Alexander was my hero. When he was home on weekends from college, things were different. My dad was afraid of him. Alexander didn't yell, but he'd stand in front of my mum, just staring, and that stare was enough. My dad would grumble but go to bed. Alexander was our peace. He promised me one day he'd get us out of here, that he'd buy us a house in Denver away from all this. The boy's voice faltered for the first time, the mention of the promise cracking his facade of stoicism. He paused, swallowing hard before proceeding to the heart of the tragedy. Until the day came. It was about 3 years ago, a Thursday. My dad had lost his job at the sawmill. He drank all day, came home out of his mind, worse than ever. He said it was my mom's fault, that she brought bad luck, that she was useless. He started breaking things in the kitchen, plates, glasses. Dylan's words now came slower, heavier, as if he had to drag them out of himself. My mom tried to calm him, and that's when he went after her. He grabbed her by the arms, yelling in her face. I'd never seen so much hate in anyone's eyes. I was 12, small, but I didn't think. I just jumped in front, tried to defend her, pushed him away from her. He stopped, his whole body tense. Sophia could visualize the scene with terrifying clarity. The small kitchen, the smell of alcohol, shards of glass on the floor, the fury of a deranged man and the desperate courage of a boy. He looked at me like I was an insect. He grabbed me by the shoulder and threw me aside, hard. I didn't fall on the floor. I fell down the stairs to the bedrooms. I only remember the noise, my body hitting the steps, and then nothing. A strange silence. When I woke up, I couldn't feel my legs. The simplicity of the phrase, "I couldn't feel my legs," was more impactful than any detailed description. It was the statement of a fact that had redefined his existence. Sophia felt tears burning in her eyes but held them back. This wasn't the time for her pain. It was the time to honor his. Dylan looked at his own legs, inert on the chair's footrest, with a kind of detachment, as if they belonged to someone else. I've been like this since that day. Spinal injury, the doctor said, irreversible. He took another deep breath, gathering strength to tell the part involving Alexander. Alexander was in finals week at college in Denver. My mom called him desperately over and over. His phone rang, but he didn't answer. He was in the library with his phone on silent. He only saw the calls hours later. When he finally got here in the middle of the night, I was already in the hospital and the doctor had given the news. My dad, he'd run off, just disappeared in the chaos. The police looked for a while, but Pine Ridge is surrounded by wilderness. He could be anywhere or nowhere. Never came back. He made a long pause and for the first time looked directly at Sophia. There was a depth in his gaze that made her shudder. Mom almost went crazy, from pain, from guilt. But she didn't give up. She's the strongest woman I know, lives to take care of me, to bathe me, to cook, to take me to the clinic. She's all I have. He then lowered his gaze to his own hands, which trembled slightly. And Alexander, he couldn't handle it. At first he tried. He came every weekend. He smashed the rest of my dad's stuff, burned his clothes in the yard. He cried hidden in his room. He researched the best doctors, set up physical therapy for me in a nearby town, paid for everything. But he couldn't look at me. Every time he saw my chair, I saw the guilt in his eyes. The guilt for not answering the phone. He got it in his head that if he'd come sooner, if he'd stopped my dad, none of this would have happened. Dylan's chin trembled. One day, he sat where you're sitting now and said he couldn't take it anymore. That looking at this house, this street at me, was a constant reminder of his failure. He said he was leaving for good, that he'd work double, triple to send money so we'd never lack anything. Therapy, meds, food, everything. But he couldn't come back. He couldn't bear the guilt, and then he left, and he kept his promise. The money hits the account every month, without fail, but he disappeared. The story ended, but its echo filled the entire porch, the whole town, Sophia's entire world. She finally understood. Alexander's silence wasn't about betrayal, shame, or indifference. It was about a pain so colossal, a self-imposed guilt so devastating, that he had to amputate himself from his own past to survive. He hadn't abandoned his family. He'd fled from himself, from the ghost of a brother he couldn't protect, from a call he didn't answer. The secret wedding, the refusal to bring the family, it wasn't to hide them from her. It was to protect her from them, to keep his world of pain and tragedy completely separate from the world of love and normality he was desperately trying to build with her. Sophia felt her chest tear. The man she loved wasn't a liar. He was a survivor, carrying on his shoulders a burden that wasn't his, punishing himself with exile for a crime he didn't commit. And she, in her distrust, had almost condemned him for the one thing keeping him standing: the silence. The echo of Dylan's story accompanied Sophia throughout the drive back to Denver. The road, which on the way there had been a path to distrust, was now a route of penance. Every curve in the ridges, every mile of asphalt seemed to reflect the twists her mind was taking, reprocessing every memory, every conversation, every silence from Alexander under the devastating light of the truth. His image was no longer that of a mysterious man, but of a modern Atlas, condemned to carry the weight of a world of pain on his shoulders. The guilt she felt was corrosive. While he struggled to build a fortress to protect her from his past, she, with her distrust, had dug a tunnel straight to the epicenter of his pain, exposing everything he most strove to keep buried. She hadn't just discovered his secret, she'd violated it. The silence in the car was absolute, but her mind was a chaos of voices. Dylan's resigned voice, her own nervous laugh upon hearing the secret wedding proposal, and Alexander's calm voice, now haunted by a sadness she finally understood. Upon arriving at her apartment, the familiarity of the place seemed strange, like a set from a life that was no longer hers. She looked at the picture frame on the shelf, a photo of them smiling at a waterfall, and felt a pang in her chest. His smile, which before seemed merely serene, now revealed a melancholic depth she'd never noticed. She knew that at some point Dylan would tell him, but in that instant she no longer cared. What mattered was that he knew she understood him. The first thing she did was grab her phone. She needed to talk to him. She needed to say she knew, that she understood, that she loved him not despite his past, but because of the strength he'd shown in surviving it. The call went to voicemail. "Alexander, it's me. Call me, please. We need to talk." She tried again. Voicemail. She sent a text. "I'm worried. Give me a sign of life." The hours dragged on, and his silence on the other end began to turn into an abyss. Sunday night came and went, and he didn't return from Grand Junction as promised. Monday dawned grey and oppressive, and his absence was a hole in the middle of the routine. She called the office, making up some excuse, and found out he hadn't shown up for work. Panic began to set in, cold and creeping. Alexander had vanished. The following days were a blur of anguish. Sophia functioned on autopilot, her body present in marketing meetings, but her mind miles away, lost in increasingly somber scenarios. Had he found out she'd gone to Pine Ridge? Had the grocery store owner, or Dylan himself, told him about the big city girl visit? The idea that her intrusion had scared him off was torturous. She'd forced the door of his sanctuary of pain, and he, in response, had disappeared completely, perhaps forever. With every phone notification, her heart jumped, hoping it was him. But it was just work emails or messages from her friends asking about wedding preparations, a cruel irony that made her want to scream. She felt suspended in limbo, unable to move forward, unable to go back, trapped in the deafening silence he'd left behind. Love and guilt waged a battle within her, and uncertainty was the battlefield. Then, almost a week after her return from Pine Ridge, when Sophia was at the limit of her strength, her phone vibrated in her hand. The name Alexander on the screen made her heart stop and restart in a frantic rhythm. It wasn't a call but a text message, short, direct, without any preamble or apology for the absence. Just 4 words that contained a universe of meaning. "We need to talk. I'm in Pine Ridge." He'd hidden out at a friend's place in Grand Junction, trying to gather courage to return to the town that terrified him. An immense relief flooded her, so strong her legs buckled. He was alive. He was in Pine Ridge. He wanted to talk. There was no accusation in the message, just a call. Sophia didn't hesitate for a second. There was nothing to think about. She replied with a simple, "On my way," dropped everything she was doing, grabbed her car keys, and for the second time in a week, made the drive to the heart of Colorado. This time, though, she wasn't going as an investigator, but as someone going to meet her destiny, their shared truth. The road seemed shorter, the landscape less melancholic. There was a purpose in her journey, a fragile but real hope that the silence could finally be broken, not by force, but by surrender. When she arrived on Pine Ridge's cobblestone streets, the afternoon sun cast a golden, soft light over the village, as if nature itself was setting the stage for a reconciliation. She parked the car in the same spot, but instead of heading to the grocery, her gaze was immediately drawn to the little brick house up the street, and that's when she saw it. The scene was so powerful, so laden with pain and love repressed for years, that Sophia stopped in the middle of the street, her breath caught in her throat. In the small dirt yard beside the house, Alexander was kneeling on the ground, not with the upright posture of the marriage proposal, but bent, broken. His arms wrapped around Dylan's legs, who remained in his wheelchair, and his face was buried in his brother's lap. Alexander's shoulders shook with silent, deep sobs, the sound of his guilt dam finally breaking. Dylan, in turn, had one hand resting on his brother's head, stroking his hair in a consoling gesture that inverted the natural order of ages. Evelyn looked at Sophia with tenderness, without resentment, just gratitude for the woman who had brought her son back. Beside the two, standing, was a woman with grey hair tied in a bun, her face marked by worry lines but her eyes shining with unshakable strength. It was Evelyn. Her trembling hands rested on the shoulders of her 2 sons, uniting them, forming a triptych of pain, reunion, and forgiveness. Sophia felt she was intruding on a sacred moment, an instant that belonged only to that family, but she also knew she was part of it now. Slowly she approached, her steps careful on the dirt. The sound made Alexander lift his head. His eyes, red and swollen, met hers, and in them was an ocean of devastation. It was the look of a naked man, stripped of all his defenses, all his secrets. He stood up slowly, staggering, and took a step toward her. "Soph," he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "You came." She just nodded, unable to speak. "I heard you were here," he continued, without any trace of accusation. "Dylan told me. I panicked, ran, but I couldn't run anymore. Your courage in coming here forced me to have mine." He looked at his brother, then at his mother, and back to her. "I should have answered the phone, Soph. That day, I was in the library so focused on a stupid exam. If I'd answered, I'd have come running. I could have stopped it. I destroyed everything. His life, my mum's peace, our chance to be a family." The words came out as a final confession, the guilt that had poisoned him for years finally verbalized. But before Sophia could respond, before she could say the guilt wasn't his, Evelyn's weak but firm voice interrupted her. She approached Alexander and touched his face with infinite tenderness. "No, my son," she said, her eyes full of tears that weren't of sadness but of resilient love. "It wasn't you. You were just a boy too. What destroyed this family was the drink, the hate it plants in men's hearts. It wasn't you." And then she hugged him, a mother's hug that had waited years to be given, a hug that said, "You're forgiven, you can come home." There, in that small dirt yard, under Colorado's golden sky, forgiveness happened. It wasn't a word, but a feeling, an acceptance. 3 broken hearts marked by the same tragedy, but which, after years of silence and distance, finally reunited in the universal language of pain and love. And Sophia, standing there, witnessing that moment, understood that the wedding she'd planned so much wouldn't be at a fancy ranch or a cold courthouse. It would be there, on that sacred ground, where healing was just beginning. The months following that reunion in Pine Ridge weren't of magical instant happiness, but of a slow reconstruction, brick by brick. Healing, Sophia learned, isn't an event, but a handmade process, requiring patience, dedication, and an infinite dose of love. Alexander didn't go back to being the carefree man she thought she knew at first. Instead, he became someone infinitely more real and deeper. The serenity that before seemed like a mask now revealed itself as a strength forged in the fire of adversity. He started therapy, a step he himself admitted he should have taken years earlier, and began untying the knots of guilt that suffocated him. Conversations between him and Sophia became a sanctuary of honesty, where fears, insecurities, and hopes were shared without reservation. And most importantly, the bridge to Pine Ridge, once dynamited by trauma, was being meticulously rebuilt. Every weekend they made the trip together. It was no longer a journey of investigation or escape, but of return. They brought groceries, helped Evelyn with small home repairs, and above all, spent time with Dylan. Alexander, little by little, learned to look at his brother not as a monument to his failure, but as a symbol of resilience. They discovered new rituals, playing chess on the porch, watching sci-fi series that Dylan loved, and on one particularly emotional afternoon, Alexander took him to a more modern rehab center in a nearby town, where new therapies brought a spark of hope and more autonomy for the boy. Sophia, in turn, became part of that landscape, that family. She and Evelyn developed a silent and powerful bond, sown during fresh brewed coffees and long kitchen talks while preparing lunch. Alexander's mother, with her simple wisdom and unshakable strength, taught Sophia more about forgiveness and unconditional love than any book ever could. It was on one of those afternoons, while the smell of apple pie baking in the oven filled the house, that the wedding idea resurfaced, not as a plan, but as a natural consequence of everything they were living. "Let's get married here," Sophia said, looking out the kitchen window at the small garden Evelyn tended with such care. Alexander, seated at the table, looked up, surprised. "Here? In Pine Ridge?" "Yes," she confirmed, with a certainty that came from her soul. "I don't want mansions or caterers. I want to get married here on this ground where your family reunited, where you started to heal, where I understood what true love is." The decision was sealed not with contracts, but with a tight hug and silent tears of gratitude. The wedding was set for a spring afternoon, when the ridges were greener and Evelyn's garden flowers more vibrant. There were no printed invitations, just phone calls to Sophia's parents and a handful of close friends. No luxury, no party for hundreds. The celebration would be the union itself, the living proof that love had won. The day dawned with radiant sun, painting the sky a deep blue. The setting was the house's yard, the same place where Alexander had knelt in tears months before. Now the space was transformed. Small wooden chairs were arranged on the grass, an improvised arch was decorated with flowers picked from the garden, and the smell of earth and orange cake mingled in the air, creating a scent of home, of rebirth. Sophia wore a white dress, simple and flowing, that danced with the gentle breeze. In her hands a bouquet of wildflowers, which Evelyn, with teary eyes, handed to her, saying, "For the daughter life gave me." The most touching moment, however, was the ring entrance. Dylan, with physical therapy, had gained more strength in his arms and torso. With fierce determination in his gaze, he propelled his wheelchair down the grass aisle himself, carrying on his lap a small white pillow where the gold rings gleamed under the sun. He stopped in front of his brother, and the smile they exchanged, a smile of complicity and victory, held more meaning than any speech. When it came time for the vows, under the emotional gaze of her parents, the few friends, and the grocery store owner who'd come to honor them, Alexander took Sophia's hands. His body trembled, not from nervousness, but from a raw, overwhelming emotion. "Soph," he began, his voice choked, "for so many years, I lived in an exile I created myself. I built walls around me because I thought I didn't deserve love, didn't deserve peace. I carried a guilt that kept me from breathing, and then you came. You didn't try to tear down my walls with violence. You simply planted a garden around them, with so much patience and so much love that they crumbled on their own. You taught me that love isn't the absence of pain, but the courage to face it together. You, Soph, were my salvation." He turned to his mother and brother. "And Mom, thank you. Thank you for never giving up on us even when I gave up. And Dylan, you're the strongest man I know. You're my hero." Tears streamed freely down everyone's faces. Evelyn approached and hugged her son, holding him tight against her chest, as if with that gesture she could heal all the wounds of the past. "You came back, my son," she whispered in his ear, "and that's all that matters." Sophia, with a trembling voice, made her own vows. "Alexander, I didn't fall in love with a perfect man. I fell in love with a real man, a man who showed me that our scars don't define us, but tell the story of our strength. I promise to honor your past, celebrate our present, and build with you, with Dylan and Evelyn, a future where love is always our foundation. I love you." When the justice of the peace declared them husband and wife, the bells of the small church in the village center, arranged beforehand by a friend, began to ring. The sound spread through the valley, echoing off the ridges, as if the world itself was celebrating that union. The sky in the background opened in a spectacle of colors, a golden and orange late afternoon that seemed to bless everyone. And for the first time in years, Alexander smiled, a full open smile without the weight of guilt, without the shadow of pain. The father had disappeared into the world, a wound that might never fully close, but love, stubborn and resilient, had come home. The silence that once tormented him, the silence of an unanswered call, was now filled with peace, with his family's laughter, with the sound of the church bells. And Sophia, holding her husband's hand, understood the deepest truth of all. Some loves don't come to spare us from life's storms. They come to be our safe harbor in the midst of them. They don't heal just the heart. They restore the entire soul. The sound of the bells mingled with their laughter, echoing off the ridges. The past had fallen silent. Love at last spoke louder. If this story touched your heart, give it a thumbs up. Write in the comments, "Love always wins," if you believe that forgiveness can heal any pain. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next emotional stories of love, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Thank you so much.